The antikythera mechanism. The year is approximately 100 BC. A merchant ship is crossing the Aegean Sea somewhere between Crete and the Greek mainland, carrying bronze statues, glassware, coins, and one object that doesn't quite fit the rest of the cargo. It's a wooden box, roughly the size of a shoebox, packed with interlocking bronze gears, so precisely machined they could have been cut yesterday. Then the ship sinks. It lies on the seafloor for 2,000 years, and in 1901, a sponge diver hauling nets off the island of Antikythera pulls up something that will quietly detonate everything we think we know about ancient technology. The object recovered from that wreck, what we now call the antikythera mechanism, is a fully functional analog computer. Let that sit for a moment. Not a clever sundial. Not a decorative clock face. A device containing 37 interlocking bronze gears capable of predicting solar and lunar eclipses, tracking the motion of the 5 known planets, calculating the timing of the Olympic Games, and modeling the irregular orbit of the moon, all simultaneously by turning a single hand crank. It was built somewhere between 150 BC and 60 BC. The next machine of comparable complexity wouldn't be constructed for roughly 1,400 years. For decades after its recovery, the mechanism sat in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, partially studied, largely misunderstood. Then, in 1974, physicist Derek DeSalla Price published a landmark analysis that identified the gearing system and estimated its function. He called it a great astronomical clock, and admitted in print that its existence violated his assumptions about ancient engineering. But it was the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, an international team that conducted high-resolution CT scanning of all 82 surviving fragments in 2006, that revealed the full picture. The gears don't just interlock. They encode the Saros cycle, a 223-month periodicity that predicts eclipses, calculated to within hours. The front dial displays a planetary model that Tony Freeth of University College London decoded in 2021, showing that it tracked all 5 planets known to ancient Greek astronomy. This was differential gearing, a specific mechanical concept that Girolamo Cardano wouldn't reinvent until 1575 AD. Think about what that gap means. 1575 minus 100 BC. That's approximately 1,670 years in which differential gearing existed, was demonstrated in a working device, was available to be studied, and then disappeared completely. Not a single gear-bearing artifact. Not one surviving written description of the mechanism's construction. Not one mention of anything like it in any ancient Greek inventory, museum catalog, or philosophical text. The device that should have launched the mechanical age vanished as completely as if it had never existed. The mainstream explanation is both reasonable and genuinely unsatisfying. Greek civilization, particularly the tradition centered on Alexandria and Syracuse, produced extraordinary mechanical thinkers. Archimedes reportedly built a planetarium. Ctesibius invented water clocks. Hero of Alexandria cataloged mechanical devices extensively. Most of these objects were made of wood, bronze, and organic materials, perishable, meltable, recyclable. The Antikythera mechanism survived only because the ship carrying it sank before the metal could be repurposed. The absence of similar devices in the record, this argument goes, doesn't mean they didn't exist. It means they were destroyed. But here is what that explanation doesn't answer. If the mechanism was the apex of a long tradition of Greek mechanical engineering, where are the intermediate steps? Not the finished products. The intermediate steps. The gear-cutting tools. The design documents. The apprentices' practice pieces. The descriptions in philosophical or mathematical texts of how such a machine works. Archimedes' surviving writings describe levers and pulleys and siege engines. Hero's Pneumatica runs to dozens of devices. No one, not one ancient Greek author in any surviving text, describes differential gearing, or a working planetary model. The tradition that supposedly produced the antikythera mechanism left not a single written trace of the knowledge required to build it. Some researchers ask a different question. The mechanism's astronomical calculations are built on the Babylonian Saros cycle, a system developed not in Greece, but in Mesopotamia, centuries before Greece had an astronomical tradition at all. Babylonian astronomers had tracked the Saros cycle empirically for hundreds of years, recording it on clay tablets that predate the mechanism by 500 years. Could the antikythera mechanism be a physical translation of Babylonian astronomical knowledge into Greek mechanical engineering? And if so, is the tradition it belongs to Greek at all? Or is it the final visible artifact of something much older, from a civilization that left its mathematics in clay and its machines at the bottom of the sea? We don't know. Probably won't. What we do know is that the most sophisticated mechanical device of antiquity appeared without precedent, functioned without parallel, and disappeared without successor. It is sitting in a museum in Athens right now. You can look at it. And after everything we've learned about it in the last 20 years, we still can't fully explain how it got there. From a machine that predicted the motion of the heavens, we descend to something far more intimate, a medicine sitting in your cabinet right now, in a bottle that says it was invented in 1897. It wasn't. Aspirin and the willow bark secret. The pill you reach for when you have a headache was patented by the Bayer Company in 1897. The Sumerians were prescribing the exact same active compound, extracted from willow bark, more than 4,000 years before that. The only thing Bayer genuinely invented was the trademark. Here is what the standard history of aspirin tells you. In 1897, a German chemist named Felix Hoffmann, working at Bayer Laboratories in Elberfeld, synthesized a stable form of acetylsalicylic acid. Bayer patented it, named it aspirin, a combination of A for acetyl and Spearsor, the German name for salicylic acid derived from meadowsweet, and began selling it commercially in 1900. It became one of the best-selling drugs in history. Hoffmann is frequently credited with a medical breakthrough that changed how humanity manages pain and inflammation. The discovery is dated to the late 19th century, and the story begins and ends in Germany. Here is what the standard history of aspirin does not tell you. The Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical document discovered at Luxor in 1872 and dated to approximately 1550 BC, contains a specific recommendation: apply willow bark for fever and inflammation. This is not folk wisdom buried in a mythological text. The Ebers Papyrus is one of the most systematic medical documents from the ancient world. It runs to 110 pages and describes treatments for conditions ranging from crocodile bites to depression. The willow bark entry is clinical. It specifies preparation and application. And willow bark's active compound, salicin, metabolizes in the human body into salicylic acid. The molecule Bayer patented 3,400 years later. The Ebers Papyrus is not the oldest evidence. Sumerian cuneiform tablets from Nippur, dated to approximately 3000 BC, reference willow preparations in the context of pain management. Hippocrates, writing around 400 BC, specifically recommended willow leaf tea for fever and pain during childbirth, a recommendation he attributed to existing medical knowledge, not personal discovery. By the time a Church of England vicar named Reverend Edmund Stone wrote a letter to the Royal Society in 1763, formally reintroducing willow bark as a fever treatment to European medicine, he was careful to note that he hadn't discovered it. He had found it in existing folk tradition. The geographic reach of this knowledge is what makes the convergence so striking. The Cherokee used willow bark for headaches. The Ojibwe used it for joint pain. Both are documented by 19th century ethnographers who noted these tribes had no contact with Sumerian or Egyptian medical texts. West African traditions recorded by the 18th century describe similar uses. Across cultures that had no documented contact with each other, The same plant's anti-inflammatory properties were identified, isolated, and applied in ways functionally identical to what Bayer patented. The active compound doesn't change because the continent does. Hofmann's genuine contribution was synthesis, producing a chemically stable, standardized form of the compound that could be manufactured consistently and administered in controlled doses. This is not trivial. Natural salicylic acid, extracted directly from willow bark or meadowsweet, irritates the stomach lining. Acetyl salicylic acid is gentler. The pharmaceutical form was an improvement, and the ability to mass produce it at a consistent dose was genuinely new. Mainstream pharmacology is correct that this represents real innovation. But there is a significant difference between improved the delivery mechanism and invented the cure. John Mann, in his study of the history of pharmaceutical chemistry, argues that ancient pharmacological knowledge was far more systematized than the modern medical establishment typically acknowledges. The Ebers Papyrus doesn't just mention willow bark. It specifies dosage forms, preparation methods, and clinical indications in language that maps almost directly onto what a modern physician would call a formulary. When Reverend Stone was describing folk wisdom, he was describing the surviving edge of a medical tradition that was centuries deep before it even entered the written record. What else then? If aspirin, the world's most prescribed drug, present in 5000 BC Sumerian tablets, common knowledge in West Africa, the Americas, and Egypt, required a 19th century German patent to enter mainstream history, what other ancient medical knowledge is sitting in ethnobotany texts and museum archives, waiting for a pharmaceutical company to discover it and file the paperwork? We may never know how old the willow bark tradition truly is, because the people who knew it best didn't always write it down in languages that survived. What we know is that the molecule existed, the knowledge existed, and the practice existed, for at least 5,000 years before the trademark did. From the pharmacies of ancient Mesopotamia, we cross into the Iraqi desert, where an archaeologist working in the 1930s pulled a clay jar out of the ground and accidentally built a battery. The Baghdad Battery. In 1936, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm Koenig was working at a site called Kujut Rabu near Baghdad, excavating what appeared to be a Parthian-era workshop. Among the finds was a clay jar, about 14 centimeters tall, unremarkable in appearance. But inside the jar was an arrangement of materials that Koenig had never seen in an archaeological context. A copper cylinder wrapped around an iron rod, the whole assembly sealed at the top with asphalt. Koenig had spent his career in the ancient Near East. He recognized what he was looking at. It was a galvanic cell, the same operating principle as a modern battery. He published his hypothesis in 1938. The archaeological establishment was largely dismissive. Then, in 1940, an American engineer named Willard Gray built a replica using the same materials and proportions, poured in grape juice as an electrolyte, a liquid the ancient Parthians would have had readily available, and measured the output with a voltmeter. The replica generated between 1.5 and 2 volts of direct current. That is enough to power a small LED light. It is the same output as a standard AA battery. It came from a clay pot in the Iraqi desert that is somewhere between 2,000 and 2,250 years old. The geometry of the device is not accidental. A copper cylinder, an iron rod suspended concentrically inside it, and an acid or saline electrolyte. These are the 3 necessary components of a galvanic cell, the same design that Alessandro Volta assembled in 1800 when he formally invented the battery. Volta's contribution, like Bayer's with aspirin, was formalization and documentation. But the fundamental electrochemical principle, dissimilar metals in an electrolyte producing current, was apparently understood, or at least achieved, in Parthian Iraq somewhere between 250 BC and 224 AD. What Koenig found was not a single jar. Multiple jars of similar construction were found at Parthian-era sites in the region, sometimes in clusters. This is not consistent with accidental construction. A solitary clay jar with odd metallic contents might be a storage anomaly. Multiple identical jars at multiple sites suggest a known, reproducible artifact, something craftsmen knew how to make and made repeatedly. Koenig noted that the jars were found in contexts that suggested workshop use, not kitchen or tomb contexts. In the 1970s, a German researcher named Arne Egebrecht pushed the hypothesis further. He built a replica battery, or rather a series of them wired in sequence, and used the combined current to electroplate a silver figurine with gold. The process worked. It produced a thin, even coat of gold on the silver surface, indistinguishable in appearance from gold leaf application, but achieved electrochemically. And when Egebrecht examined ancient gold-covered artifacts from the region, he noted that some showed characteristics more consistent with electroplating than with traditional gold leaf techniques, a uniformity and adhesion that was difficult to explain through mechanical application alone. The Smithsonian Institution conducted its own replica testing and confirmed electrical output from Baghdad battery-style configurations. The physics is not in dispute. The question is what the Parthians, or whoever developed the design before them, understood about what they were producing. The mainstream explanation is skeptical and not unreasonable. The most common alternative interpretation among archaeologists is that the jars were used to store sacred scrolls or papyrus documents, the metallic components serving as part of a preservation mechanism. Others suggest the configuration was used to hold ritual objects. No written description of electrochemical processes survives in Parthian texts. No wiring, no circuit components, no evidence of electrical application has been found alongside the jars. Without documentation of intent, critics argue the battery interpretation is reverse engineering a modern concept onto an ancient artifact. But the geometry remains. You do not arrive at a copper cylinder, an iron rod, and an asphalt seal by storing scrolls. Those are not materials that naturally combine for archival purposes. The configuration is too specific, too precisely replicable, too electrochemically correct to be an accident of storage practice. And the clustering of identical jars at multiple sites argues against a one-off anomaly. Some researchers ask whether the Baghdad battery represents not a Parthian invention, but a Parthian inheritance, a technology received from an older tradition, understood functionally, applied practically, most likely for electroplating decorative objects, but never theorized. The Parthians may have known how to make it without understanding why it worked, in the same way that the medieval physician knew willow bark relieved fever without knowing what salicylic acid was. If so, the technology arrived at Kujut Rabu from somewhere earlier, and that earlier source has not been found. Yet, from a lost power source in the Iraqi desert, we move to a weapon whose power has never been fully replicated, a blade so precisely engineered that modern metallurgists have spent decades trying to reverse engineer it and only partially succeeded: Damascus steel. Crusader knights who faced Damascus steel blades in battle came home with accounts that sounded, to European ears, like sorcery. A sword that could slice a falling silk scarf in half mid-air, yet flexible enough to bend in an arc without snapping. An edge that held through hundreds of blows that would have dulled any European blade. The surface rippled with a faint, watered pattern, swirling lines in the metal that no one in Europe knew how to produce. European smiths spent centuries attempting to replicate it. They never fully succeeded. And around 1750, the last swordsmiths who knew the secret died. The specific ore source they depended on was disrupted, and the formula vanished. For nearly 300 years, Damascus steel was the greatest unsolved problem in metallurgy. The blade has two names depending on where you start the history. In Syria, it was Damascus steel, named for the city through which it was traded. In India, it began as woots, a specific high-carbon steel produced in the Telangana region in crucibles under controlled conditions, using iron ore with trace concentrations of elements that turned out to be critical. The Indians had been producing woots since at least 300 BC, It traveled via trade routes to the Persian Gulf, to Central Asia, to Syria, where craftsmen worked it into blades that carried the Damascus name into European legend. The material was Indian. The reputation was Syrian. The mystery, when the formula disappeared, was universal. Modern metallurgy began seriously attacking the problem in the 1990s. John Verhoeven and Alfred Pendray at Iowa State University spent years attempting to reproduce the distinctive surface pattern, the Woots banding visible in authentic Damascus blades, and the mechanical properties that made the steel so exceptional. They succeeded partially, identifying that the pattern emerged from cyclic carbide banding formed during the cooling process, and that the specific ore used in original Woots production contained trace amounts of vanadium, molybdenum, and manganese that triggered the necessary crystalline structure. No standard iron ore produced the same result. The secret, they concluded, was not just technique. It was the specific geochemistry of the Indian ore source. When that source was disrupted, possibly by a shift in trade routes around 1750, the formula became unrepeatable, even to those who thought they knew it. Then, in 2006, a team led by Peter Poffler at Dresden University published an analysis in the journal Nature that changed the conversation entirely. Using electron microscopy, they examined fragments of authentic Damascus steel and found something no one had anticipated: carbon nanotubes, cylindrical structures of pure carbon, nanometers in diameter, embedded throughout the steel matrix. Carbon nanotubes are a material we associate with 21st century nanotechnology, structures typically produced in laboratory conditions using chemical vapor deposition, laser ablation, or arc discharge. They require precision temperature control, specific atmospheric conditions, and knowledge of carbon chemistry at the molecular level. And they were present, consistently, in a steel alloy forged in a pre-industrial Syrian workshop sometime before 1750. The mainstream interpretation of the nanotube finding is that their formation was an emergent accident, an unintended consequence of specific ore composition combined with specific heating and folding cycles, a process the Smiths understood intuitively and replicated empirically without understanding the underlying chemistry. This is plausible. The Smiths didn't need to understand nanotechnology to produce nanotubes. They needed to follow a process that produced them as a byproduct. The knowledge was in the hands, not the theory. But this raises a question that materials scientists have not fully resolved. If the process that produced carbon nanotubes and Damascus steel was empirically discoverable by pre-industrial craftsmen following inherited techniques, why can't modern metallurgists, with electron microscopes and spectrographic analysis, reliably reproduce it? Verhoeven and Pendray came close. No one has fully replicated the nanotube structure. The Rockwell hardness of authentic Damascus blades, 60 or above on the C scale, comparable to modern high-carbon tool steel, has not been consistently matched using historically documented methods. And behind Damascus lies the Indian Woots tradition, which predates it by centuries. The Telangana ore sources, the crucible techniques, the specific temperature cycling. These weren't Syrian innovations. They were Indian, and they were old. Behind the Indian tradition, the question of origin opens again. Who first understood that this specific ore, processed this specific way, produced steel unlike anything else? The trail of technique goes back, but the origin of the knowledge does not appear cleanly in the record. The last master of Damascus steel died with the formula unwritten. The nanotube structure it produced is still not fully explained. The ore that made it possible is no longer used. 3 centuries of attempts to reconstruct it have produced excellent swords, but not quite that one. From the forge rooms of ancient Syria, we cross to the Mediterranean and to Rome, history's most celebrated engineering civilization, the builders of aqueducts, amphitheaters, and domes that still stand. Except the most impressive of those domes was built with a formula that Rome absorbed from somewhere older, and that modern concrete still cannot match. Roman concrete. The Pantheon in Rome has a dome spanning 43.3 meters, the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. It was completed around 125 AD. It has no internal supports. It has no reinforcing steel. It has sustained nearly 2,000 years of earthquakes, invasions, floods, and the general entropy that has leveled everything else around it. And it is not cracking. Modern engineers built a replica structure using contemporary Portland cement concrete. It started showing stress fractures within decades. Rome is celebrated as the civilization that invented concrete. The reality is more interesting. Rome did not invent concrete. It inherited a formula from older Italian cultures, possibly Etruscan, possibly even older, perfected it in a specific regional form, and then lost it so thoroughly that it took until the 21st century and an electron microscope to understand why it worked. The critical discovery came in 2017 when geologist Marie Jackson and her team at the University of California, Berkeley published a paper in the journal American Mineralogist that answered a question 2,000 years old. What made Roman marine concrete? The concrete used in harbors, piers, and seawalls, not just resistant to seawater, but actually strengthened by it. The answer was tobermorite, a rare aluminous mineral that crystallizes slowly within the concrete matrix when seawater infiltrates it, forming interlocking platelet structures that progressively reinforce the material from within. Modern Portland cement, by contrast, degrades in marine environments. The calcium silicate hydrate that gives it strength dissolves when exposed to seawater over decades. Roman marine concrete, 2,000 years in, is tougher than when it was poured. The key ingredient was volcanic ash from the region around Pozzuoli, near Naples, pozzolana, which is where the term pozzolanic concrete originates. Mixed with seawater and lime in specific proportions, pozzolana triggered the tobermorite reaction. Vitruvius, a Roman engineer writing around 27 BC, described the formula in De Architectura, specifying the use of Pozzuoli ash and noting that the resulting material hardened even underwater. He described it working. He did not explain the chemistry, which wouldn't be understood for another 2,000 years. The harbor at Caesarea Maritima, built by Herod the Great around 22 BC off the coast of what is now Israel, deployed this formula at extraordinary scale. The underwater concrete structures there are intact. 2,000 years of Mediterranean seawater have not degraded them. For comparison, modern marine concrete infrastructure typically requires major repair or replacement within 50 to 100 years. Now consider the provenance question. Pozzuoli sits on land that was Greek colonial territory before Rome controlled it. Greek settlers from Cumae had established there around 700 BC and had been building with local volcanic materials for centuries before Roman engineers adopted the practice. The Etruscans, who were sophisticated builders and whose influence on early Roman architecture is documented but often minimized, also had access to volcanic ash deposits in central Italy. The formula that Vitruvius describes as Roman may have been Etruscan. Before that, it may have been Greek colonial. Before that, it may have been the inherited practice of local Italian cultures whose names we don't know, because Rome absorbed them before they left enough records. Vitruvius himself, in a rarely quoted passage, credits the discovery of pozzolanic concrete not to Roman engineers, but to the people of Pozzuoli, suggesting that what Rome did was not invent the formula, but scale it. Apply it systematically. Build the Pantheon, the Colosseum, the Baths of Caracalla. The engineering tradition that produced those structures was genuine, enormous, and world-changing. But the material at its core was older than Rome, and the question of how much older remains genuinely open. After Rome collapsed, the formula went with it. Medieval builders had Vitruvius's text. It survived. They had access to Pozzuoli ash. It was still in the ground. What they lacked, apparently, was the specific knowledge of proportions, mixing technique, and curing conditions that turned the ingredients into something extraordinary. They built with inferior lime mortar instead, and their structures reflect it. The material science required to understand why the Roman formula worked. The tobermorite crystallization, the slow cure dynamics, the seawater chemistry, wasn't available until 2017. You needed an electron microscope to read the recipe that Vitruvius wrote down in 27 BC. The pantheon doesn't crack. The recipe that built it is now partially understood. The civilization that first developed it has been forgotten. What we call Roman concrete should perhaps carry a longer, more complicated name. From construction that lasts millennia without a crack, we move to communication. The printing press, the invention that supposedly launched the modern world. Except it already existed 400 years earlier in a country that never received the credit. The printing press and the Gutenberg myth. In 1040 AD, a Chinese artisan named Bi Sheng made individual characters out of fired clay and arranged them in an iron frame to print text. He could rearrange the characters for the next page, then rearrange them again, indefinitely. It was movable type. The technological principle universally credited, in Western history, to Johannes Gutenberg, who developed his version 400 years later, and is still celebrated as the man who changed the world by making books accessible to everyone. Bi Sheng's name does not appear in most Western accounts of printing history. This is not an oversight. It is a pattern. The documentation is unambiguous. Scholar Shen Kuo, a contemporary of Bi Sheng, described the ceramic movable type system in detail in his Dreampool essays, completed around 1088 AD. The text is specific. Bi Sheng carved individual characters into clay, fired them to hardness, set them in an iron frame with a resin wax adhesive for printing, then broke them free and rearranged them for the next job. Shen Kuo evaluated the system's advantages and limitations with the analytical precision of a technology journalist. This is contemporary documentation of movable type in 1040 AD, not myth, not reconstruction, contemporary documentation. By the time Wang Jin, a Chinese agricultural engineer, developed wooden movable type around 1300 AD, he had added a revolving type table, a mechanical innovation that allowed a compositor to spin the entire type array and locate individual characters quickly, dramatically speeding up the setting process. Wang Jin documented his system in the Agricultural Treatise of 1313. Gutenberg had no comparable mechanical efficiency improvement. Then Korea. The Goryeo dynasty produced metal movable type by 1234 AD, replacing Chinese ceramic with bronze, which was more durable and produced sharper impressions. The Jikji, a Korean Buddhist text printed using metal movable type in 1377 AD, is the oldest surviving book produced by this method. UNESCO formally recognized it in 2001 and placed it in the Memory of the World Register. It sits in the National Library of France in Paris, where it was taken in the 19th century. The Jikji is 200 years older than anything Gutenberg printed, and it is in Paris. Gutenberg's system, developed in Mainz around 1440, incorporated genuine innovations. He developed an oil-based ink compatible with European vellum. Existing water-based inks didn't adhere properly. He adapted a modified wine press screw mechanism into a printing press capable of even pressure distribution. He developed a specific lead antimony tin alloy for his type, which was harder and more durable than Chinese ceramic or carved wood. And he understood, critically, the economics of mass production, organizing his workshop as a commercial enterprise capable of producing hundreds of identical copies simultaneously. The Gutenberg Bible, completed around 1455, was a triumph of industrial organization as much as technology. These contributions were real, but contribution is not the same as invention. The intellectual environment of 15th century Europe was saturated with goods, technologies, and ideas flowing from the East via established trade networks. Paper itself, which Gutenberg required, had arrived in Europe from China via Arab intermediaries, documented in Spain by the 12th century and spreading steadily westward. Paper-making knowledge traveled the Silk Road. Printing knowledge also traveled the Silk Road, in the form of block-printed texts, patterns, and possibly descriptions of movable-type systems that reached Persia and the Arab world before Europe. Thomas Christensen, in his work on the history of printing, argues that Gutenberg's development of movable type, occurring precisely as paper became widely available in Germany, almost certainly reflects awareness, however indirect, of existing Asian printing technology. The historian's standard defense is independent invention. Similar problems, solved independently, produce similar solutions. This is a real phenomenon, but it strains credibility as applied here. Gutenberg's press arrives in Europe at the exact moment that paper, the material required to use it, finishes spreading from China via the Arab world. The conceptual breakthrough of movable type had already occurred, been documented, and been refined across 4 centuries of Chinese and Korean practice. And the Silk Road, the most active information transfer network in the medieval world, connected those traditions to the environment in which Gutenberg worked. Francis Bacon, writing in 1620, named printing as one of 3 inventions that had changed the world more than any empire or political revolution. He believed it was born in Europe. He didn't know about Bai Sheng. Most people still don't. From the workshops of Asia and Europe, we travel back further, to the ancient Mediterranean, to a Greek-Egyptian mathematician who built a functioning steam turbine in the 1st century AD, described it in a text that survived, and received no credit when civilization reinvented it 17 centuries later and called it a revolution. The steam engine and hero of Alexandria. In 1769, James Watt patented a steam engine and changed the world. 1700 years earlier, a Greek-Egyptian mathematician named Hero of Alexandria built a functioning rotary steam turbine, described it in detail in a book that survived, and received exactly nothing when Western civilization rediscovered the principle and called it a new invention. Hero's device, described in his work Pneumatica around 50 AD, was called the Aeolipile. The design is simple and ingenious, a hollow metal sphere mounted on a pivoting axis, connected by a pipe to a sealed boiler below. As the boiler heated water, steam traveled up into the sphere and escaped through 2 curved nozzles positioned on opposite sides, and the reaction force spun the sphere. It was a jet propulsion turbine, the same physical principle that drives every steam turbine in every power station operating on Earth today. Hero documented the device not as a curiosity, but as an engineering demonstration, and his Pneumatica is a catalog of working machines, vending devices, programmable carts, automated temple doors, wind-powered organs. He was not a philosopher dabbling in toys. He was an engineer documenting a tradition. The text survived. This is the critical and maddening fact. Hero's Pneumatica was preserved through the medieval period, translated into Arabic by scholars in the Islamic Golden Age, and then back into Latin by European Renaissance translators. By the 16th century, the Aeolipile was available to any European scholar who could read Latin. The device was known. It was discussed. And for more than 1,000 years after its rediscovery, nobody made it bigger. Thomas Newcomen built the first practical atmospheric steam engine in 1712, producing a device that used steam to create a vacuum beneath a piston, driving pumps in Cornish tin mines. He was aware of Hero's Aeolipile. The device had been published and discussed among engineers of the period. What Newcomen recognized was that atmospheric pressure, not jet reaction, was the practical force to exploit. The reaction turbine Hero demonstrated didn't scale easily to pumping water. James Watt's 1869 improvement added a separate condenser, dramatically improving efficiency. What Watt invented was not the steam engine. It was a better steam engine, based on Newcomen's improvement of a pressure-atmosphere relationship that Hero's text had described 1,700 years earlier. The gap between Hero's Aeolipile and Newcomen's atmospheric engine, approximately 1,660 years, is one of the most debated silences in the history of technology. The standard explanation is that the gap reflects not suppression, but economics. Hero's Alexandria was a slave economy. Steam-powered machines automate labor. In a world where human beings were an abundant and cheap labor source, there was no economic incentive to develop mechanical labor substitutes. The Aeolipoli remained a philosophical demonstration because no one needed it to be more than that. The Industrial Revolution wasn't triggered by a discovery of new technology. It was triggered by the economic conditions, labor costs, resource availability, commercial demand, that finally made an ancient principle worth scaling. Serafina Cuomo, in Technology and Culture in Greek and Roman Antiquity, advances this argument carefully. The Romans, inheriting Alexandria's intellectual tradition, possessed all the mechanical knowledge needed to industrialize. What they lacked was the incentive. When labor is free, machines are luxuries. When labor is expensive, machines are necessities. The Industrial Revolution was a response to rising labor costs in a northern European economy with expanding commercial demand. Not a discovery. It was a deployment of existing knowledge into new economic circumstances. This reframing is intellectually unsatisfying in a specific way. It means the Industrial Revolution was preventable. Or more precisely, it means it could have happened at any point in the preceding 17 centuries if the economic conditions had aligned differently. The workers displaced by the spinning jenny in the 1770s were not victims of new knowledge. They were victims of old knowledge, finely applied. And Hero himself, who, in addition to the Aeolipoli, documented the first programmable device in history, a cart with a string and peg guidance system, the first coin-operated vending machine, and a variety of hydraulic and pneumatic mechanisms, sits in the historical record as a curiosity. His name appears in engineering history courses. His Aeolipoli is displayed in museum reconstructions. But James Watt, who built Hero's device in iron and called it an invention, has a unit of power named after him. The Aeolipili demonstrated the principle. The gap between principle and application was 1700 years. The credit went to the man who closed the gap, not the man who opened it. From a technology that waited 17 centuries to be used, we travel to an architectural achievement that predates its supposed inventors by millennia: the arch. The structure that supposedly made Roman engineering possible, and that was already ancient when Rome was built. The true arch and the civilizations Rome forgot to credit. Ask an architecture student who invented the arch, and the answer comes quickly: Rome. Ask an archaeologist who has excavated a Sumerian tomb in southern Iraq. A tomb built 5,000 years ago, its entrance still standing, its corbelled stones still holding. And the answer is more complicated. The true arch, the self-supporting structure that holds itself together through the compression of wedge-shaped stones converging on a central keystone, was a mature, widespread technology 2,000 years before a single Roman brick was laid. The question of what inventing an architectural element means is legitimately complex. Building techniques evolve continuously, often in multiple places simultaneously, and attributing the arch to a single culture is a simplification even within the mainstream. But the consistent attribution of the arch to Rome in popular history, in school curricula, in architectural surveys, while the Mesopotamian and Indus Valley precedents sit in academic literature largely unknown to the general public, is not a simplification. It is an erasure. The University of Pennsylvania Nippur expedition, one of the most important early excavations in Mesopotamia, documented true arches at the ancient Sumerian city of Nippur, dated to approximately 3,800 BC. These were not tentative experiments. They were structural arches in drainage systems and tomb entrances, built with voussoir-style wedge stones designed to transfer load to the sides, rather than relying on the structural integrity of the capstone alone. The same expedition and subsequent excavations at Ur found arched structures spanning the period from roughly 3,800 to 2000 BC, across multiple sites in the Tigris-Euphrates basin. The true arch in Mesopotamia was a tool of everyday engineering. The Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India from roughly 2600 to 1900 BC, built true arches at Mohenjo-Daro. John Marshall's excavations, published in Mohenjo-Daro and the Indus Civilization in 1931, documented arched structures in the city's drainage and building systems. This is one of the most sophisticated urban civilizations in the ancient world, with standardized brick sizes, indoor plumbing, and grid-patterned streets. And it built arches while the city that would eventually become Rome was a farming village. Egyptian arched brick constructions at sites near Luxor have been dated to approximately 3200 BC. In Ireland, the corbelled entrance passage of Newgrange, built around 3200 BC, uses an angled corbelled arch over the entrance passage. Not a true voussoir arch, but evidence that arch-like structural logic was present in Atlantic Europe at the same time it appeared in the Near East. The principle was not Roman. It was global. Rome's actual contribution to arch architecture was scale and systematic application. The Romans understood the arch's engineering potential, that it could span distances, support enormous loads, and be extended in sequence to form a barrel vault, or crossed to form a groin vault, and applied this understanding at a scope no previous civilization had matched. The aqueduct, the triumphal arch as monumental civic marker, the amphitheater, the dome of the Pantheon, which is itself an arch rotated around a vertical axis. These are genuine architectural achievements of organizational ambition, engineering precision, and political will. They are not, however, the invention of the arch. What Rome actually inherited the arch from, at least in its Italian application, appears to have been the Etruscans. Roman engineers themselves acknowledged Etruscan precedents in construction. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, whose arched entrance is still visible near the Forum, is traditionally attributed to Etruscan builders working under early Roman kings. The Etruscan arch tradition predates Roman dominance of Italy, and the Etruscans were themselves in contact with Greek and Eastern Mediterranean building traditions. The trail leads backward. Rome from Etruria. Etruria from Greek colonists and Eastern Mediterranean trade. The Eastern Mediterranean from Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia from we don't know. The arch appears in the Sumerian record fully formed, not experimentally. Its earliest instances are already structural, load-bearing, applied. Who taught the Sumerians the arch? That question does not yet have an answer. What we know is that the architecture student who answers Rome is not wrong that Rome used the arch magnificently. They are simply repeating a history that decided to start the story late, after the older civilizations had done the foundational work, and before they could advocate for their own credit. From stone arches spanning the ancient world, we cross the Atlantic to the Americas, and to a civilization that was supposedly primitive, and yet produced an artifact that may be the oldest magnetic compass ever found. The Olmec compass and the navigation secret. The compass is universally credited to China. The earliest confirmed Chinese magnetic direction-finding device, the Han Dynasty lodestone spoon, called the Sainan, is dated to approximately 200 BC. This places the invention of the compass in China, roughly 2,200 years ago, a discovery that eventually transformed global navigation. It is a settled piece of history, except that in the 1970s, a polished hematite bar was found at an Olmec site in Mexico, dated to approximately 1000 BC, that appears to have been deliberately manufactured to orient to magnetic north, 800 years before the Chinese Sinan, in the Americas, by a civilization that mainstream archaeology has consistently treated as isolated, pre-scientific, and incapable of the kind of systematic magnetic knowledge that such an artifact implies. The artifact, catalogued as San Lorenzo piece CE8, was discovered during excavations at the Olmec site of San Lorenzo Tenochtitlan in the early 1970s by archaeologists Michael Coe and Kent Flannery. It was a bar of magnetite, the naturally magnetic iron oxide mineral known as lodestone, polished to a flat surface with a groove cut across one end. In 1975, astronomer John Carlson of the University of Maryland conducted a systematic analysis and published his findings in the journal Science, one of the most rigorous peer-reviewed venues in the scientific world. His conclusion: when the bar is floated on a piece of cork or wood in still water, it consistently orients to within 0.95 degrees of magnetic north. The groove, he argued, functioned as a sighting line, allowing the user to align an object with the indicated direction. San Lorenzo is one of the oldest major Olmec sites, active from approximately 1200 to 900 BC, making the Olmec the earliest known complex civilization in Mesoamerica. The culture that produced the colossal stone heads, the first writing systems in the Western Hemisphere, sophisticated astronomical observation, and a trade network spanning from central Mexico to what is now Honduras, apparently also produced a bar of polished magnetite that points north. The Olmec did not work hematite casually. Archaeological evidence shows they mined, transported, and processed magnetic iron ore over considerable distances. The deposits used at San Lorenzo came from sources more than 100 kilometers away. Hematite mirrors, polished flat to precise specifications, are documented at Olmec sites and were clearly valued objects. The treatment of magnetic iron ore as a specialized material, sourced specifically, worked precisely, finished carefully, is not consistent with accidental discovery. It is consistent with deliberate engagement with the mineral's properties. The mainstream response to Carlson's paper was skepticism, and the skepticism is not without basis. The artifact could be a mirror fragment or a cosmetic palette. Hematite was used for both in Mesoamerican cultures. The orientation to magnetic north could be coincidental. Any flat piece of magnetic mineral, balanced carefully, will orient to some degree. Without written evidence that the Olmec understood magnetic direction finding and applied it to navigation or orientation, the interpretation remains speculative. Carlson himself acknowledged this in his paper, framing his finding as a hypothesis requiring further investigation. The further investigation largely didn't happen, at least not in the direction of taking the artifact seriously as a compass. No subsequent systematic survey of Olmec magnetite artifacts looked for patterns consistent with intentional magnetic orientation. No analysis of Olmec site orientation patterns examined whether buildings or monuments aligned to magnetic north in ways that would indicate awareness of the property. The paper sits in the Science Archive, cited occasionally in alternative archaeology literature, absent from mainstream histories of navigation. What would it mean if the Olmec had independent knowledge of magnetic north? It would not necessarily mean they were sailing by compass. The practical application of magnetic orientation to open water navigation requires a different set of technologies, including the ability to follow a bearing over distance. But it would mean that in the Americas, approximately 1,200 years before the European Age of Discovery, a civilization understood that certain minerals point in a consistent direction and manufactured instruments to exploit that property. The implications for how we understand Mesoamerican astronomical and directional knowledge are substantial. Some researchers, including Ivan van Sertima in his work on pre-Columbian transoceanic contact, have argued that Olmec civilization shows a range of evidence, including the African features of the colossal stone heads, suggesting external influence that mainstream archaeology minimizes. The compass artifact is one element of a broader argument. It remains contested, as such arguments should, but John Carlson's data, precise measurements, peer-reviewed, published in Science, has not been refuted. It has simply been set aside. The artifact is in a museum. The paper is in the archive. And the history of the compass still credits China in 2200 BC, as if nothing in the Western Hemisphere happened before Columbus arrived. From a navigation tool in the Americas, we travel to a medical practice that crossed oceans by a different route. arriving in Europe from Ottoman Turkey and West Africa, attributed to an English country doctor, and changing the world under a name that erased the people who invented it. Vaccines, variolation, and the Ottoman secret. Edward Jenner is credited with inventing the vaccine in 1796. His image appears on public health commemorations. The Nobel Prize in Physiology is awarded in his intellectual tradition. When the World Health Organization declared smallpox eradicated in 1979, the only human disease ever fully eliminated, the achievement was traced, in popular history, back to a country physician in Gloucestershire who noticed that milkmaids who caught cowpox seemed immune to smallpox, tested the observation on a farm boy named James Phipps, and published his findings in a pamphlet. This is an accurate account of what Jenner did. It is not an accurate account of where the immune principle came from. The practice of variolation, deliberate inoculation with smallpox material to confer immunity, was documented in China by approximately 1000 AD, possibly earlier. Chinese texts describe several methods: blowing dried smallpox crust powder through a tube into the nostril, inserting material under the skin, or having children wear the clothing of smallpox sufferers. Zhang Yan, a physician in the court of the Longqing Emperor, is documented as having used variolation to protect royal children around 1567 AD, more than 2 centuries before Jenner. The practice was known, refined, and applied at the highest levels of Chinese society more than half a millennium before it was invented in England. In the Ottoman Empire, variolation was a standard practice by the early 18th century, performed by women known as inoculators, who traveled from village to village. The procedure involved extracting material from a mild smallpox pustule and introducing it under the skin of a healthy person, typically inducing a mild infection that conferred lasting immunity. The mortality rate of deliberate variolation, when performed correctly, was approximately 1 to 2%. The mortality rate of natural smallpox infection was 20 to 30%. The mathematics of the practice were understood empirically, if not theoretically. In 1714, Emmanuel Timoni, a physician working in Constantinople, published a description of the Ottoman variolation practice in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, the premier scientific journal in Britain. The paper was specific, clinical, and backed by case studies. It described the technique in enough detail to replicate it. It was read by members of the Royal Society. It was published 82 years before Jenner's paper appeared. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, the wife of the British ambassador to Constantinople, had her son variolated in 1717 and immediately recognized the public health implications. She was a formidable personality, a writer, an intellectual, and a woman who had survived smallpox herself and watched her brother die of it. She returned to England in 1718 and championed the practice aggressively, arranging a royal trial in which condemned prisoners were offered variolation in exchange for pardons. The trial succeeded. The prisoners survived. The practice began spreading slowly into British medical culture. Then, there is Onesimus. In 1716, an enslaved African man named Onesimus, held in Boston by the Puritan minister Cotton Mather, described a practice common in his home region of West Africa: intentional introduction of smallpox material to confer immunity. He showed Mather a scar on his arm from the procedure. Mather convinced, championed variolation during Boston's catastrophic 1721 smallpox epidemic, working with physician Zabdiel Boylston to inoculate nearly 300 people. The results were dramatic. Mortality among the inoculated was approximately 2%. Among the uninoculated, approximately 14%. Onesimus's name appears in Mather's diary and in a few specialist historical accounts. It does not appear in the history of vaccines as it is taught in schools. The West African variolation tradition that Onesimus described, and that he said was common knowledge in his region, may be significantly older than any of the Chinese or Ottoman documentation. How old is not known, because the tradition was oral, and oral traditions in West Africa were systematically disrupted by the transatlantic slave trade during precisely the centuries when we might otherwise have documented them. Jenner's specific contribution was genuine and important. He substituted cowpox material, far safer than live smallpox, for the variolation procedure, reducing the mortality risk of inoculation from 1 to 2% to near zero. He conducted controlled trials, documented his results rigorously, and published in a form that allowed global replication. The shift from variolation to vaccination was a real medical advance. But the immune principle, the foundational idea that deliberate exposure to a pathogen or related agent confers protection, was not Jenner's. It was Chinese, documented from 1000 AD. It was Ottoman, documented formally to the Royal Society in 1714. It was West African, practiced well before Jenner by people whose names and traditions were systematically erased. The vaccine did not begin in Gloucestershire. It arrived there from the East and from Africa, carried by diplomats, enslaved people, and the slow diffusion of medical knowledge across the networks of empire. Edward Jenner is in the history books. Onesimus is not. That asymmetry is not an accident of history. It is a decision about whose knowledge counts as knowledge and whose practice counts as science. These 10 stories follow the same arc. A technology exists, working, documented, sometimes centuries deep, in a civilization that official history has decided doesn't count as the origin point. Then someone in a recognized tradition formalizes it, patents it, publishes it in English or Latin or German, and the original is retired to a footnote or erased entirely. The antikythera mechanism appears without predecessor and vanishes without successor. The willow bark molecule becomes aspirin. The Baghdad battery sits in a museum, while Volta gets the credit. The printing press is invented in Germany, 40 years after a Korean metal-type Bible was already being read. The mainstream view of these stories is not wrong about everything. Gutenberg's press did something Bischeng's didn't. It spread. Jenner's vaccine was safer than variolation. Roman concrete was applied at a scale that earlier cultures hadn't attempted. Systematization, formalization, and mass deployment are genuine contributions to human progress. Knowing that bark helps a headache is different from understanding why, and the translation of empirical knowledge into reproducible science has real value. But contribution is not the same as invention. In the consistent pattern, stripping credit from civilizations that were non-Western, non-literate, politically conquered, or simply inconvenient to the dominant narrative is not an accident. It is a structural choice made repeatedly across centuries of how history is written, taught, and commemorated. The Baghdad battery is in a museum in Iraq. The Jikji is in Paris. The Olmec compass is in an archive that most historians of navigation have never consulted. Onesimus, who may have brought the foundational immune principle from West Africa to the Western world, died enslaved. The inventions survived. The inventors did not always make it into the story. History is not a record of who discovered what. It is a record of who had the power to write it down in a language that survived, publish it in institutions that were recognized, and claim the credit in political environments that were listening. The antikythera mechanism's gears turned for 60 years before anyone realized what they were looking at. The willow bark cure worked for 5,000 years before anyone filed the paperwork. Most people walk away from history class thinking civilization is a straight line running from Greece to Rome to Europe to now. You stayed to the end. You've seen the evidence. The line isn't straight. It's a web, and a lot of the threads lead to places the textbooks don't go. Subscribe and don't miss the next thread. In the comments, tell me which invention hit hardest. Which one did you already suspect? Which one genuinely surprised you? Make your case. The floor is yours. Every invention on this list has a ghost. The civilization that built it first, the name that didn't make it into the textbook, the discovery that was made twice because the first time didn't count. Like the antikythera mechanism's gears turning in the dark for 2,000 years, waiting for someone to look closely enough. The forgotten builders didn't disappear. We just stopped looking. Subscribe and keep looking.